I don't know what's in the mind of Donald Trump or in the mind of Xi Jinping, but it's just hard to see how either one of them in the short term get to I mean, there's I guess the possibility of a sort of a tiny deal, something, buy a few soybeans and a couple of hog bellies, but I just don't see that there's going to be something that gets us back to where we were, or even close to where we were at the start of the Trump administration. I don't even think we can get back to the deal we were at in May that was on the table before the two sides walked away.
Anyone who tries to make predictions about the trade war, or frankly any other element of this administration's foreign policy, is on a fool's errand. Unpredictability has been the one predictable thing. What I would say is it's very difficult for me to see a comprehensive agreement or settlement emerging anytime before the 2020 U.S. election. And frankly, I am skeptical that even a short-term sort of Band-Aid where everybody gets to save face and say that they won something, even that seems unlikely. Yeah.
It's really fair to say the U.S. and China trade conflict has probably had some effect on China's environmental and climate change policy making. However, as I mentioned earlier, China sees the interest and the benefits to charge on and continue on this path to become cleaner, greener, and even with our overseas investment policy. For example, in April, China has held the second Belt and Road Initiative Forum, and President Xi Jinping even came out and said, green needs to be the shade for when the base shade for the BRI. And because of those, even if there might be some short-term setback to the climate change policy because of the US-China trade war, we are very confident that the government will just continue with their climate commitment and climate policy down the road, despite what's going on with the US-China relations.
We call it a trade war, but it's not just about trade. I think every time I get the chance to say that, I'm saying that nowadays, because it's kind of getting embedded in everybody's assumption that we're just talking about trade. We're talking about trade, investment, people flows, all sorts of stuff. Number two, deals. What do deals really mean? We need to unpack that as well. I mean, if a deal means some kind of understanding to put a floor under the relationship or a temporary ceiling on escalation, those things are possible. If a deal means resolving the underlying reasons why we have a systemic conflict cooking up here, I don't think a deal around that is likely anytime soon. So the central tendency, as we might say in economics, in the relationship is going to be one of re-engineering it and tension for, I think, a long while to come.
Currency depreciation, which is being driven by the market, not by China's policymakers, is still a positive for China in the trade war. Think about it like this. The US is imposing 10%, 20%, 25% tariffs on Chinese goods. If the yuan drops 5, 10, 15% against the dollar, that's a pretty much direct offset for some of the tariffs. It ensures that China's exports remain competitive. So a bit of yuan depreciation is good for China. The question is, how much is a bit and how much is too much? And the problem with too much comes in the political dimension and in the financial dimension. Political dimension, the US Treasury, as we've seen, President Trump, as we've seen, are really focused on this currency issue. If China allows the currency to drop too far, that's going to be an irritant in Washington, D.C. It's going to make it harder for them to make progress on the larger trade war negotiation. There's also a financial dimension to this. Remember back in 2015, where we had that mini yuan devaluation, and global investors, some Chinese investors, thought that this was the beginning of the end. Hundreds of billions of dollars a month flooded out of China. The central bank had to spend hundreds of billions of dollars of its foreign exchange reserves defending the currency. And so the fear is, if you allow the yuan to fall too far, too fast, then you get back to that kind of panicked situation. That's something which Beijing wants to avoid.
I have a very particular point of view about what's going on here, that what worked for the better part of 40 years was the presumption of long-term convergence. That China wasn't where we hoped it would be necessarily in economic terms today, but that the logic of what was productive and economically efficient would inevitably continue to move us more in a coincident direction than in oppositional directions for the foreseeable future. That's come into doubt in recent years, and where the change happened wasn't really on the American side. The American economic system, despite the atypical, craziness of the Trump era, still pretty much a set of market economy norms that we're working with here. It's on the Chinese side that how we understood what reform and opening even meant has shifted. Within China, it shifted. The debate inside economic policy making in China has changed in terms of what their long-term goal is, in terms of how the economy is going to be run. What's the role of the party in shaping the business decisions that companies make, right? We didn't used to believe that that was open for debate any longer. Maybe there was a transitional period where the party was going to play a special role, but in the long run, nobody was arguing that the state could make economic decisions better than, profit-oriented boards of directors would. Now that is not so clear-cut. You won't get such a straightforward black and white answer on that from your friends in power in Beijing. And so that's fundamentally what has changed. That what China wants to be when it grows up is no longer so clear-cut, and until that's resolved, there's going to be some uncertainty about where the relationship between China and other market economies in the world, foremost the United States, but not only the U.S. This is not just a China-U.S. issue; it's a China market economies issue.
I do see a decline in the Chinese investors in the U.S., right? So it's driven by multiple reasons. Firstly, the outflow of RMB is just like the policies tighten up, it's more difficult to invest in. And then secondly, it's harder for you to have the deal pushed through. Because there are big, the large tech companies such as Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu, they showed strong interest in acquiring capabilities or startups in the US, but in reality, not all the deals can happen in the end. But on the other hand, I also see more opportunities out there to some extent. Firstly, if the export market in China it's gonna be reduced for some reason, I do see a surge at the domestic market in China. So for many US startups, there might be an opportunity for you to tap into Chinese market, more so than before, because they are not able to reach your product abroad, right? The other one I've seen is that I think there is a strong push at the government side, trying to increase the life science research capability, the innovation capability in China as a whole.
So I think the challenge for China is that they're trying to do two really difficult things at the same time. The first one is deleveraging. So in 2008, in the great financial crisis, China's exports collapsed. And the response from China's policymakers was that famous 4 trillion yuan stimulus, that big announcement by Premier Wen Jiabao. And that saved growth, but it was a stimulus that went on too far for too long. And the result was that the banks were overstretched, the state-owned enterprises took on too much debt, the local government financing vehicles took on too much debt, the real estate developers built ghost towns in the desert. In 2016, President Xi Jinping and his economic czar, Liu He, decided enough is enough. We can't carry on growing by relying on ever-expanding debt. And so we need to delever. It was the right move, but deleveraging is painful. When you try and slow credit expansion, you slow investment, and when you slow investment, you hit jobs and you hit growth. And what you want to happen when you're deleveraging is to have really strong global demand. You want your exports to be roaring higher because that provides a cushion. Yes, we're investing less, but don't worry, we're exporting more, so employment is okay, growth is okay. What happened in 2016? At exactly the moment when President Xi hit the deleveraging button, President Donald Trump got elected and he hit the trade war button. So at exactly the moment when China needed more exports, they suddenly found, oh dear, tariffs, trade war, sanctions, exports are getting hammered at the same time as investment.